The year is 1645. England is in chaos. A civil war rages between king and parliament, tearing the nation apart. Fear grips the land, not just fear of war, but of something older, darker, more insidious. Whispers of witchcraft spread through towns and villages. People vanish in the night, dragged from their homes, accused of cursing livestock, summoning demons, and conspiring with the devil himself. Those accused rarely survive. And in the center of it all is one man, the Witchfinder General. His name is Matthew Hopkins, and in just a few short years, he will accuse more people of witchcraft than England has seen in the previous century. He claims to be doing God's work, but his methods are ruthless. He doesn't wait for confessions, he forces them. He doesn't seek justice, he hunts for profit. He turns fear into a weapon, making himself the most notorious witch hunter in English history. But was Hopkins a true believer, or was he a fraud who preyed on paranoia? How did England fall into a frenzy of witch trials, condemning hundreds of innocent people? To understand the reign of the Witchfinder General, we must go back, to a time when belief in the devil's work was stronger than reason, and when fear could turn friend against friend. A time when being different was enough to get you killed. Before the rise of Matthew Hopkins, before the hysteria that swept across England, the belief in witchcraft had already taken deep root in the minds of the people. This was a world where science had not yet replaced superstition, where disease, crop failure, and even a simple misfortune were often blamed on the devil's influence. For centuries, witches had been feared but not always hunted. In medieval England, accusations of witchcraft were rare, and trials were even rarer. Witches were seen as outcasts, herbalists or healers, sometimes helpful, sometimes suspicious, but not an immediate threat to society. Then everything changed. With the rise of Protestantism and religious extremism, England became a place where the devil was no longer just a distant enemy. He was lurking in every town, every village, whispering into the ears of those willing to do his bidding. The belief grew that witches were not just harmless women with strange customs, but active agents of Satan, working against God's kingdom on earth. The first major turning point came in 1542, when King Henry VIII passed England's first Witchcraft Act. This made witchcraft a criminal offense, punishable by death. Under Queen Elizabeth I, the laws were strengthened. Then, in 1604, under King James I, the laws became even harsher. King James was obsessed with witches. He believed they had tried to kill him, and his paranoia led him to write Demonology, a book that detailed how witches operated, how to identify them, and why they must be destroyed. This was a new era of fear, an era where simply being different could cost you your life. Then, in 1642, the English Civil War erupted. The country was divided. King against Parliament. Neighbors against neighbors. Towns and villages became battlefields. The law was weakened, and local authorities were left to enforce justice on their own. It was the perfect storm for paranoia to take hold. With no central order, religious extremists began to look for the devil's hand in the chaos. And with war draining resources, villages became desperate for someone to blame for failed harvests, plagues, and unnatural deaths. It was in this environment, a nation consumed by war, fear, and suspicion, that Matthew Hopkins stepped forward. The time was right for a new kind of fear, a fear that could be manipulated, twisted, and used for power. And Matthew Hopkins would become the master of it. England in 1644 was a country in turmoil. The civil war between King Charles I and Parliament had thrown the nation into chaos. Armies clashed, villages were burned, families were torn apart by political and religious divisions. The country was exhausted, and with every year of war, fear and uncertainty grew stronger. People saw omens and curses in every misfortune. Crops failed? It must be the devil's work. Livestock died suddenly? A witch's curse. Children fell sick? Surely a neighbor had made a pact with Satan. And then came Matthew Hopkins. Hopkins was not a priest, not a judge, not even an official of the crown. He was the son of a Puritan minister, an ordinary man with no real authority. But in a world ruled by fear, all he needed was a claim and a mission. By 1644, Hopkins was living in Manningtree, Essex, a quiet town, but one where whispers of witchcraft had begun to spread. Women had been accused of dealing with dark forces, and Hopkins, eager to make a name for himself, stepped in as their self-appointed investigator. This was the moment that changed everything. Hopkins declared that he had divine insight, that he had been called by God to root out the devil's agents on earth. He named himself Witchfinder General, a title that held no legal power, but one that struck fear into the hearts of the people. And so the witch hunts began. Unlike previous trials, which were often slow and required strong evidence, Hopkins sped up the process. He developed his own methods of interrogation, brutal, relentless, designed to break the accused physically and mentally. One of his most infamous techniques was the sleep deprivation method. Suspects were kept awake for days, forced to walk endlessly to prevent them from falling asleep. Hopkins claimed that a real witch would be unable to pray, and under exhaustion, many stumbled over their words, a mistake that could cost them their life. Another method was the witch's mark test. Hopkins and his assistants would strip the accused and search for a mark on their body, a freckle, a mole, a scar, any natural blemish that could be claimed as the devil's brand. He would use a special needle to prick the skin, and if the suspect did not feel pain or did not bleed, they were declared a witch. And then there was the most infamous test of all, the swimming test. Hopkins believed that since witches had renounced their baptism, water itself would reject them. The accused were tied and thrown into a river or pond. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. If they floated, they were guilty, and executed. These were not fair trials. These were spectacles of fear, where the accused had no way to prove their innocence. By 1645, Hopkins had gained national attention. His trials were not just local affairs anymore, they had spread across England. But the worst was yet to come. Hopkins was not done. His witch hunts were just beginning, and soon entire towns would be consumed by paranoia and death. By 1645, Matthew Hopkins was no longer just a local interrogator. He had become the most feared man in England. His name spread from village to village, town to town. The legend of the Witchfinder General was growing, and his list of victims was increasing by the day. With each trial, Hopkins perfected his system. He arrived in towns with a team of assistants, often including John Stern, his trusted accomplice. They would declare that witches had been discovered, and within days, panic would spread like wildfire. The accused were often poor, elderly women, healers, widows, or those who did not conform to society's norms. They were outsiders, vulnerable, and easy targets. But soon, the accusations went beyond just poor women. Anyone could be accused. Wealthy women. Men. Even clergymen who had once doubted Hopkins found themselves on trial. His most infamous witch hunts took place in East Anglia, where entire communities were consumed by hysteria. In just 1 year, over 250 people were accused, and dozens were executed. The trials were rushed, brutal, and inescapable. One of the largest executions took place in Berry Street, Edmonds in 1645, where 18 people were hanged in a single day. And yet, no one could stop him. Hopkins was making money from his trials. Towns paid him for his services, and the more witches he found, the more he earned. His business was fear, and England was drowning in it. But Hopkins had gone too far. His methods were becoming too extreme, and even those who had once supported him began to question his motives. Soon, the tide would turn, and the hunter would find himself the hunted. By 1646, Matthew Hopkins had reached the height of his power. He had become a legend of terror, a man whose name alone could strike fear into entire villages. But something had changed. The same fear that had once made Hopkins untouchable was beginning to turn against him. At first, his witch hunts had been welcomed. Villagers believed he was doing God's work, purging their communities of evil and corruption. But as more people were accused, more innocent lives were lost, and more families were torn apart, people began to question his true motives. Doubts crept in. Why were so many of the accused poor, elderly, or social outcasts? Why did Hopkins never find witches among the wealthy or the powerful? Why did his investigations always end with him collecting a handsome fee? The towns that had once invited him now saw him as a curse. Then came his greatest mistake. He accused a clergyman. In 1646, Hopkins accused John Gowell, a Puritan minister in Great Staughton, of being a witch sympathizer. But Gowell was no easy target. Instead of cowering in fear, he fought back. Gowell wrote a scathing attack on Hopkins, condemning his methods, his greed, and his false authority. He exposed how Hopkins manipulated fear and profited from executions. And Gowell was not alone. more skeptics began to emerge. Other ministers, scholars, and even local judges started questioning Hopkins's legitimacy. People began to realize that Hopkins had no real power. He was not appointed by the king, nor by Parliament. He was a fraud who had built his reputation on lies and fear. The tide was turning. But Hopkins was not finished yet. His reign of terror was collapsing, but he still had one last fight left. And this time he would find himself on the other side of the accusations. By the end of 1646, the Witchfinder General was no longer the feared authority he once was. His power was crumbling, his reputation falling apart. Then, the rumors began. The whispers that had once been about witches in villages were now about Hopkins himself. People began to say that only a man with deep knowledge of witchcraft could accuse so many witches. They asked, how did Hopkins know exactly how witches worked? How did he know the devil's signs? How was he so sure of what to look for? And suddenly, the hunter became the hunted. In some accounts, Hopkins was accused of witchcraft himself. The very same tests he had used against others, the witch's mark, the swimming test, the sleep deprivation method, were now being whispered about in connection with him. Did he bear the devil's mark? Would he sink or float? The exact details of Hopkins's final years are shrouded in mystery. Some say he was put on trial, forced to undergo the same tests he had inflicted on hundreds. Others claim that he fell ill, weakened by tuberculosis, a fitting end for a man who had thrived on the suffering of others. But one thing is certain, by 1647, Matthew Hopkins disappeared from history. No more accusations. No more trials. No more witch hunts. The terror he had spread died with him. But the story does not end there. Because even though Hopkins was gone, his legacy would live on. His witch hunts may have ended in England, but across the Atlantic in the American colonies, the fires of paranoia were just beginning to burn. Matthew Hopkins was gone, but the fear he had created did not die with him. His methods, his accusations, his relentless pursuit of so-called witches left scars on England that would never fully heal. Even after his disappearance in 1647, the echoes of his work continued. People still whispered about witches in their midst, still feared the unknown, still saw the devil's hand in everyday misfortunes. The fear did not vanish, it simply moved. For a time, England began to recover. The chaos of the Civil War ended, Parliament took full control, and a new era of rational thinking was beginning. But across the Atlantic, in the growing colonies of North America, something far worse was about to begin. Hopkins may have been England's most infamous witch hunter, but he was not the last. In 1692, in the Puritan settlement of Salem, Massachusetts, a new wave of hysteria erupted. It would become known as the Salem witch trials, a chapter of history even darker than what Hopkins had begun in England. But how did the terror spread? It started with the same formula: fear, suspicion, and the manipulation of religious beliefs. The Puritans who had settled in the American colonies were deeply influenced by the same ideas that had driven the English witch trials. Many of them had heard stories of Hopkins's crusade against witches, and some had even read his 1647 book, The Discovery of Witches, where he outlined his methods and justifications for hunting witches. His book became a guide, a manual for future witch hunters, a blueprint for mass paranoia. And so, nearly 50 years after Hopkins's reign of terror, in the cold winter of 1692, it all began again. But this time, the consequences would be even more devastating. The Salem trials would see dozens executed, entire families destroyed, and a town consumed by fear. The Witchfinder General's influence had traveled across the ocean, and his legacy of terror was far from over. The Salem witch trials followed a chillingly familiar pattern. A pattern that Matthew Hopkins had perfected in England. It began with small accusations, whispers between neighbors, suspicions against outcasts. But in a rigid Puritan society, where religion governed everything, those whispers became law. The first accused witches in Salem were, like those in England, women who stood outside of society's norms. Some were healers, midwives, widows, or women who had no male protector. Others were simply people who had spoken against the church. And just as Hopkins had done, the people of Salem used brutal methods to force confessions. They kept the accused awake for days, asking the same questions over and over until they broke. They searched for the devil's mark, pricking their skin with needles to see if they felt pain. They even relied on children's testimonies, believing that the young were pure and could see the truth, just as Hopkins had done. The trials became a frenzy. Within months, hundreds were accused. The town descended into madness, families turned against each other, and even ministers were not safe from accusations. The executions followed. 19 people were hanged, one was crushed to death, and many more died in prison. But this time, the hysteria did not last. By 1693, the people of Salem began to realize the truth, that they had been consumed by fear, paranoia, and lies. The trials ended. The remaining prisoners were released. The town tried to erase its shameful past. But the damage had been done. The Salem witch trials had become one of the most infamous cases of mass hysteria in history, and at its core, it carried the same DNA as the trials in England. Matthew Hopkins had been dead for decades, but his methods, his beliefs, and his manipulations had lived on. But what about today? Have the days of witch hunts truly ended? Or do they still exist, just under a different name? Matthew Hopkins may have vanished from history, but the impact of his witch hunts would not disappear so easily. His actions had sparked a wildfire of fear, leaving scars across England that would take generations to heal. But in the immediate years after his disappearance, something unthinkable began to happen. For the first time, people started to question the witch trials. The same villages that had once welcomed Hopkins as a hero, that had paid him handsomely to cleanse their lands of witches, were now left with a deep, haunting regret. Entire families had been torn apart. Mothers, daughters, wives, hanged for crimes they could never have committed. Some of these women had been known in their communities for years, trusted as midwives, healers, or simple herbalists. They had helped deliver children, cared for the sick, and provided remedies for ailments, only to be accused of witchcraft and executed. The realization was slow at first, but it spread. Whispers turned to questions. Questions turned to doubt. Doubt turned into a quiet but growing outrage. Even some of the men of the church, the very people who had once justified the witch hunts, began to speak against them. One of the most outspoken voices was John Gowell, the Puritan minister from Great Staughton who had confronted Hopkins directly. Before Hopkins vanished, Gowell had written publicly about how dangerous and unbiblical the witch trials had become. His writings had been ignored at first, drowned out by fear and mass hysteria. But now, after so many innocent people had died, people began to listen. He asked questions no one had dared to ask before. Had Hopkins been a true servant of God, or had he been a fraud? Had the trials ever been about justice, or had they been about power and money? The truth was becoming harder and harder to ignore. And then, in the late 1640s, something happened that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Judges, once the enforcers of these brutal trials, began to reconsider their past decisions. In courtrooms across England, there was an undeniable shift. Trials that would have once ended in execution were now being dismissed. People who would have been immediately hanged or drowned were now being released. By 1650, the era of English witch trials was crumbling. But even as the trials slowed down, the fear did not vanish. In the minds of the people, the idea of witches, demons, and dark magic still held power. The government had to step in. But making witchcraft accusations disappear was not as easy as ending the trials. The law had created this fear, and only the law could erase it. The fight was far from over. By the early 1700s, England had changed. The hysteria that had fueled the witch trials had faded, replaced by a new movement, rational thought, science, and skepticism. But there was still unfinished business. The laws that had allowed Matthew Hopkins to operate freely, the laws that had justified his executions, still remained in place. Even though fewer people were being accused, the very existence of these laws meant that the fear of witches could rise again at any moment. And so, in 1735, Parliament made a decision that should have ended witch trials forever. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 was passed. But it didn't just end executions, it did something far more powerful. For the first time, the government declared that witchcraft itself was not real. That magic did not exist. That the devil did not give power to humans. This was unprecedented. For centuries, governments had debated how to deal with witches, but now, for the first time, they were saying that witches never existed at all. But even as the government tried to erase the past, the memory of the witch trials lived on. The scars they had left were deep and lasting. villages that never fully recovered. Families that had lost generations to executions. Communities that still carried guilt and regret. Even though the trials had ended, the same patterns of fear, scapegoating, and mass hysteria could be seen in different forms. And that is perhaps the most chilling part of Matthew Hopkins's legacy. It wasn't just about witchcraft, it was about human nature itself. The idea that fear could be used as a weapon. That entire communities could be turned against their own people. That all it took was one powerful voice to ignite hysteria. Hopkins wasn't just a witch finder. He was one of the first manipulators of mass fear. His methods, his way of turning society against itself, didn't just die with him. His influence lived on, shaping future events where fear, propaganda, and mass paranoia would once again be used to destroy innocent lives. Look at the Salem witch trials in America, where an entire town descended into madness just decades after England had outlawed witch hunting. Look at McCarthyism in the 1950s, where Americans were accused of being communists with no evidence, no fair trials, just suspicion and fear. Look at any moment in history where fear becomes more powerful than reason, where society looks for a scapegoat to blame for its problems. That is the true legacy of the Witchfinder General. His name may have faded into history, but the weapon he wielded, the power of fear, is still alive. The witch trials are over, but the hunt for an enemy continues. It always does. Because whenever fear outweighs reason, and society demands someone to blame, history has shown, the hunt will begin again. The Witchfinder General is gone, but the lessons of his reign still haunt us. His methods, his lies, his power over society, these are not just relics of the past. Because the witch hunts never truly ended. They changed. They evolved. They took on new names, new enemies, new fears. Matthew Hopkins may have called his targets witches, but history shows us that in every era, in every society, someone has been cast as the enemy. Think of the Salem witch trials, where mass hysteria and baseless accusations destroyed an entire community. Think of McCarthyism in 1950s America, when accusations of communism ruined lives, careers and families, all without real evidence, all driven by the same fear that fueled Hopkins's witch hunts. Think of modern-day conspiracy theories, where social media spreads panic, misinformation, and blame at a speed even Matthew Hopkins could never have imagined. The tools may have changed. The enemies may look different. But the pattern remains the same. Fear is a weapon. Accusations are powerful. And once hysteria takes hold, it can destroy everything in its path. This is why history must never be forgotten. Because when we forget, we allow it to happen again. So now we ask you, did Matthew Hopkins truly believe in his cause? Or was he just a con artist who found a way to profit from fear? Could something like this happen again today? Or is society finally past the age of witch hunts and mass hysteria? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story fascinating, wait until you hear about the Salem witch trials, the American witch hunt that became one of history's most terrifying examples of mass paranoia.